Have you ever wondered what would happen if you didn't sleep? Not for a day, not for a week, but for 15 straight days? There's a story, a dark tale from the late 1940s that explores this very question. It's known as the Russian sleep experiment, and it's one of the most chilling legends to ever crawl out of the internet. The story goes like this. Soviet researchers, driven by the pressures of a post-war world, wanted to create a super soldier, someone who could operate for days on end without rest. To achieve this, they selected 5 political prisoners, deemed enemies of the state, for a radical experiment. They'd placed these men in a sealed glass chamber and pumped in an experimental stimulant gas designed to eradicate the need for sleep. The men were promised their freedom if they could survive for 30 days. They had books, cots without bedding, running water, a toilet, and enough dried food to last them a month. Everything was monitored through two-way mirrors and microphones. For the first 5 days, things were surprisingly normal. The subjects, aware they were being watched, mostly kept to themselves. Their conversations were monitored, and they spoke of past traumas, their lives before the prison. But as the days wore on, the tone of their discussions grew darker, paranoid. They began to whisper into the microphones, turning on each other, believing they could win the researchers' favor by betraying their comrades. The researchers initially thought this was a side effect of the gas, but it was just the beginning. On the 9th day, the screaming started. One of the subjects began running back and forth across the chamber, screaming at the top of his lungs for 3 solid hours. He screamed until his vocal cords tore, reducing his voice to nothing more than a squeak. What was truly bizarre was the reaction of the other prisoners. They didn't react. They continued to whisper into the microphones until a second prisoner started screaming. The non-screamers then took a different approach. They took the books they were given, tore out the pages, pasted them over the glass portholes with their own feces, and cut off all visual contact with the outside world. Then silence. The screaming stopped. The whispering stopped. For 3 full days, there was absolute silence from inside the chamber. The researchers, growing anxious, checked the microphones. They were working. They checked the oxygen levels. They were normal, consistent with 5 men performing light exercise. The silence was unnerving. Fearing the worst, the researchers decided to break protocol. On the morning of the 14th day, they used the intercom, hoping to get a response. They announced, "We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor, or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom." A single calm voice replied from within. "We no longer want to be freed." Debate erupted among the researchers and the military officials funding the project. Finally, they decided they had to see what was inside. At midnight on the 15th day, they flushed the chamber of the stimulant gas and filled it with fresh air. Immediately, voices from inside began to plead, as if begging for the life of a loved one. They begged for the gas to be turned back on. The chamber door was opened, and soldiers were sent in to retrieve the subjects. What they found was a scene from a nightmare. Only 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, if you could call it that. Rations for the past 5 days hadn't been touched. There were chunks of flesh from the dead subject's thighs and chest stuffed into the floor drain, blocking it and allowing 4 inches of a bloody water mixture to pool on the floor. The 4 surviving subjects had also performed acts of horrific self-mutilation. Large sections of muscle and skin were torn from their bodies. The destruction of their own flesh was so extensive that their abdominal organs were visible through the rib cages. Their lungs were exposed, yet they were still breathing. Their digestive tracts were visible, and they were working, digesting their own flesh, which they had apparently torn off and eaten. The soldiers, hardened veterans, refused to enter the chamber to remove the subjects. The subjects themselves fought back with unimaginable strength when the soldiers tried to move them. They fought as if their lives depended on staying in that room, on getting the gas back. One of them, during the struggle, had his spleen rupture and bled out almost instantly. The medical staff tried to sedate him, but it took more than 10 times the normal dose of morphine, and it still didn't work. He fought until his last breath. The remaining 3 were restrained and moved to a medical facility. 2 of them, still with intact vocal cords, continued to beg for the gas. They needed to stay awake. As surgeons attempted to repair the damage, they discovered something truly horrifying. The subjects were completely immune to the sedatives and anesthetics. When the surgeon tried to operate, one of them laughed maniacally on the operating table. He thrashed so violently against his restraints that he tore a 4-inch leather strap, snapping the wrist of a 200-pound soldier. It took more anesthetic to quiet him down, but the moment his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. He was dead. The last subject, who could still speak, was prepped for surgery. He also refused anesthetic. When the surgeon asked why, he simply said, "I must remain awake." The procedure was performed without any sedation. The subject didn't flinch, didn't cry out, didn't react at all as the surgeon worked to replace his organs and cover them with what remained of his skin. The nurse watching said his lips curled into a smile whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery was over, the surgeon asked why he had done this to himself, why he wanted the gas. The subject looked at him, smiled, and said, "Have you forgotten so easily? We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread." The surgeon paused. He asked, "What are you?" The subject's grin widened. "We are you." He then uttered his final request. "We must remain awake." The lead researcher, against the protests of his colleagues, ordered him to be sealed back in the chamber with the gas. He was sealed in with 2 other researchers who had joined him. As they prepared to seal the door, the final subject, the one who could no longer speak, broke his restraints, lunged, and tore the throat out of one of the researchers. The lead researcher drew his pistol and shot the other researcher in the head. He then aimed the gun at the silent subject, who was now pinned on the floor, looking up at him. "What are you?" The researcher screamed, "I must know." The subject, with what little life he had left, managed a weak smile and rasped his final words. "So nearly free." The researcher fired, and the experiment was over. Of course, this is just a story, a creepypasta. There's no historical evidence that the Russian sleep experiment ever happened. But it taps into a primal fear, doesn't it? The fear of what lies dormant inside our own minds, the madness we suppress just by closing our eyes each night. It makes you wonder what's really happening in the dark. Quiet hours when the world sleeps, and what might happen if one day we simply stopped. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this dive into the dark side of the web, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unsettling stories. Stay curious and maybe don't skip too much sleep.